Okay, so apologies for that. I think we're back on track now. So what I want to do is begin by just briefly talking about some possible preconditions for a register-based census. Our colleague, Mr. Lars, in his opening remarks, he talked about some of the preconditions. Then I want to talk about assessing those preconditions. It's all very fine having a list, but you need to then check to see whether you have actually achieved those preconditions. And then finally, I want us to talk a little bit about some of the things that countries might find useful to actually achieving those conditions, and then we shall go into the small group discussion. So, preconditions. Oh dear, technology. When Mr. Lars spoke earlier today, he talked about a number of these things, and I'm just going to go through these at a reasonably high level. The first thing is about having appropriate legislation. Important to have legislation that enables your office to do a census. Now that might sound sort of an obvious thing, but I'm certainly well aware of some countries, not necessarily in this region, who when they decide to go down the path of a register-based census, find that their legislation doesn't allow them to do it. Their legislation prescribes, states quite clearly, that they must carry out a traditional census every 5 or 10 years. So you've got to have the right legislation for your stats office. You've also got to have the right legislation that enables you to access administrative records. Again, that is specific to your own country situations, but there have certainly been other situations where countries have discovered that, again, their legislation doesn't allow them to access administrative records, or perhaps the converse, that the administrative agency's legislation does not allow them to provide the data to the statistics office. So therefore, really important that when you're thinking about the legislation, you are not just thinking about the statistics office, you're thinking about the agencies who you need to provide your administrative data. And that naturally leads on to the whole issue about strategic support. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean support from the decision makers, our political leaders, the senior people in the agencies that you need. Perhaps it's the senior people in administrative agencies. Perhaps it's some of the senior people in places like the equivalent of the Ministry of Finance or the Department of Finance. The people who are really important for making decisions in your country. You need their support so that they understand what you're doing. It's often useful for a stats office to have some key supporters in those agencies so that you can talk to them about barriers or problems that you may have. For example, in some countries, again, I'm not talking specifically about the region, where perhaps they have run into blockages, they have run into agencies who perhaps are not willing to provide administrative data. Having some friends in high places is a very useful thing for a stats office. Now, for those of us who've spent all or most of our careers in statistics offices, we're often not used to dealing with senior people in government or senior officials. We're often people who are most happy dealing with numbers, dealing with the process of producing statistics. But this is a really important role as you get more and more up the senior part of a statistics office. This becomes an important part of your role, to get that strategic support. In his presentation, Lars talked about the importance of understanding user requirements. If you're going to be doing an administrative census or a traditional census, we all know the importance of actually having a clear set of requirements. In a traditional census, for those that are used to that model, that becomes important because you design your questionnaire based on that. In a traditional census, you're using that as your base to go out and talk with agencies, finding what data sources they've actually got. So before you're even doing any activities with data, important to have that clear set of requirements. Now, for many of you in this room, you or your colleagues are in the process of considering that draft set of user requirements, the draft data basket for the GCC harmonised census. That's an important place to start, but it also is not the only place. You need, as we were having that discussion before the break, to go and talk to your key users. What are the things that are really important to them? Your government users, your researchers, and indeed perhaps part of the community, international organisations. You as the Stats Office need to know what your user requirements are. The next point I've made here is, I've called it statistical use of the registers, but this means that when you actually get to access the registers, you can actually use them for statistical purposes. So simple things. You've got to be able to have some form of identifier, some way of uniquely identifying the records. Really, it's the sort of the basic thing. Think about this from a paper form example. You don't want to confuse your identifiers on your paper forms. Absolutely critical that you can do this with your administrative data. But also, there is no point, as Mr. Lars said in his opening remarks, if the administrative data is going to be provided 2 or 3 years after your census date. So when I'm talking here about statistical use of the data, it's you thinking about what's critical for you in your census. You have a census date that you want to bring all the data in. It's not just having the data in by that period, it's having the administrative data about that period. Have you got identifiers? Is the data there for that period? Can you bring it together? Those sorts of statistical things. Lars also touched on, and our next session after this one is talking much more about quality. But within your own agency, you need to have a clear view about quality. How are you going to measure and monitor the quality? How will you decide to include some data? How will you decide to exclude it? Because excluding it is just as important as including it. So you need to have some clear rules at the beginning. That you may modify those over time, but as we've talked about and as we'll talk about later, there are a number of international frameworks regarding quality frameworks which give you some tools to start with. One of the fundamental differences between a traditional census and a register-based census is, of course, that in a register-based census we rely on a range of methodologies to bring that data together. Now, we're going to discuss those in much more detail tomorrow, but the key point I want to make is if you're going to be progressing down the path of a register-based census, you need to have identified your methodologies. How do you broadly think you're going to bring the data together? Are you going to try and do a full register-based census? Are you going to use the registers to perhaps identify all the people or all the addresses and then go out and collect some data face-to-face? You need to have thought about that at the very beginning. So you've got some broad ideas. Now you may, as you get access to the data, that may evolve over time, but without thinking about it means that you can't think about some of the next points that I want to move on to. Infrastructure. Now, as we heard before, as we introduced ourselves, There are a number of people here in the room who come from the IT parts of your organisation. You don't need to be told, so you can tune out for this bit, how important it is to have a set of user requirements before you start to build a system, before you start to even design a system. And one of those key pieces of infrastructure that the IT colleagues have to do in conjunction with their IT colleagues from the other agencies is to identify how is the data going to come in. Now, each country has different forms of government infrastructure. Some countries have a very comprehensive network, a government network, where if an agency, one administrative agency wants to send another data, they've got a very secure network, not accessible to the general public, but just accessible to those government agencies. That's at one level. In other cases, I've known of administrative data being provided to the Statistics Agency on floppy disks. Remember floppy disks, those of you who are over 30? On USB sticks, or at the worst case, on paper. So what I'm talking here about is the infrastructure, IT infrastructure, but you need to have not just thought about the IT infrastructure for your stats office, but your wider government infrastructure. And then how will you manage that data within the statistics office? When I was a young statistician, which was a couple of years ago, because I have got a little grey hair now, when I was first involved with statistics, a population census was the largest statistical activity that any country ever undertook. It required huge amounts of access to IT systems. And that's still, a census may not be the largest activity anymore, but it's still true. The census requires lots of access to IT systems. Now, our two colleagues here have got the hands-on experience with IT in running administrative censuses, can talk more about this than me. But certainly what you need to be doing is thinking about what is the size of how much space are you actually going to need with all of these data sets coming in, because you will be bringing in data. Not all of it you will actually end up using in the census, but you've got a lot of processing, a lot of manipulation to be thinking about in that system. So hence that thinking through that overall design, how are you going to design your census, becomes really important for the IT colleagues to be working out how they're going to put that infrastructure together. It's also critical for the next point I want to mention here, which is resources. Now, when those of us who've run traditional censuses before will know, with traditional censuses, the biggest resource problem is people. Those armies of enumerators that we have to, whether you call them enumerators or whether you call them data collectors, but those people that go out, knock on the doors, use an iPad, a PDA or a piece of paper to collect the information. They are our biggest resource. And we have at the back of the office a smaller group of people, and I'll talk a bit more about that on Tuesday. But you need to be thinking about what are the resources, what are the skills that you will need in order to run your administrative census, because they are different. For those that are doing a combined census, you will need a small army of enumerators, but you're going to need, as a register-based census does, a team of people who can look at the data, statistical analysts, skilled IT people, people who can think about what the data means. Now, in the traditional census, we often leave that piece of thinking about what the data means to the beginning. We think about what we might need at the beginning, and then at the end. But in a register-based census, those people are intimately involved all the way through that census process. One of the questions just before the break was asking about timelines. And we're going to talk a bit more about timelines later in the week. But again, you've got to really know at the beginning what your broad timeline are, like what your timeline will be. Because you're not just doing this yourself. You're doing this with a large number, potentially a large number of other stakeholders. And as you recall from one of the slides that Mr. Lars showed, in Denmark, for example, they had many, many administrative agencies. And those agencies need to know, when do they have to provide the data? When will the stats office go back with queries? If they've got queries, perhaps not having received the full file. They need to know when the data is going to be released. So your timetable no longer becomes something that's just for the stats office to hold close to its heart, but it's actually something that's important for your administrative agencies as well. And that brings me to the last point, which is about organisation. So there are a number of things that you need to think about in terms of organisation. Some of it is about how you're going to organise yourself internally within your stats office, but some of it is also how are you going to work with those other stakeholders, some of those people that I just mentioned briefly in terms of strategic support. For some countries in the region, I'm well aware that an important part of planning the census is setting up a cross-government census committee. And that is a really important way of getting input and support and often good ideas from the other administrative agencies and some of those senior stakeholders that I mentioned before. For those of you, but even within a cross-government committee, you still need to think about how you're actually going to organise the work within your office. And I just want to make a small point in relation to some of Mrs. Hess's opening remarks. She mentioned that the census is one of the most important things that we're doing across the GCC system. But I just want to make the point that it's one of. It's not the only thing. So for you and your stats office, particularly this comment is mainly for senior folks, you're having to think about the census as one of the many things you're doing, how you're organising it. The day has finished where we can, as stats officers, say we're only going to do the population census for 6 months and everything else will stop. That's a situation because of the things that your users need. They need more than just the census. So within your stats office, you have to think about how you're organising the census as well. So what I want to now just do is just mention some things here that are important. So you've got some preconditions. It's, if you like, a checklist. Within your stats office, you then need to go through and review that with your senior management team. Have a good look. See where you are, excuse me. Identify the gaps. What are the critical gaps? What are the things that you actually have to deal with? Prioritise them. We can't all fix everything at once. So you need to come up with your own plan, your own priority list. Develop some action plans. How are you actually going to close these gaps? How are you going to achieve those preconditions? And then the next point is actually implement those action plans. So if one of your gaps that you've identified is that you need to change your legislation, if your senior management agree that they're committed to administrative census, you need to follow the steps of changing your legislation. and work out the time frame and do all the activities. Now, I'm going to make my final comment on this slide as a former census manager. I spent a lot of time in my home country, New Zealand, managing our census and being intimately very involved with previous censuses. In a census, you get very focused on the census. The census becomes the most important thing in your life. Often, yes, in your life. And in the work context, you can think that the census is the most important thing. But as we are moving to administrative data, not just for census, but for other things as well, it's important that you take an organisation-wide view, not just thinking about how the census will benefit, but how other things will benefit. How will this benefit labour statistics? What does this mean for the creation of a business register? So you're wanting to think about those things. I'm not saying the census people should own all of those problems, but you need to take a wider view. And that's why it's important when you're thinking about your organisation structure that you have people from across the organisation involved to help you think through those. So I've talked briefly about assessing and identifying the gaps, and each of you have to do that within your own agency. I'm not going to sit here and say this is how you do that. You find a way that works within your own office. What I want to now talk about briefly, because I want to give you plenty of time for discussion, is developing action plans. So I'm not going to go through this super detail, but for example, if one of the things that you have done in your assessment is identified that you don't have the appropriate legislation, now it may be the legislation doesn't allow you to conduct a register census because it directs you to do a traditional census. Maybe the legislation doesn't explicitly allow you to access registers. You need to do some possible steps here. Reviewing your legislation, reviewing the legislation that governs your office. Perhaps you have statistics law in addition. Reviewing the laws for the admin agencies. And then working out if amendments might be needed. Now sometimes it is just a matter of making a small amendment. It, as I'll say in a moment, takes time. Some cases it may be a time when the office decides this is an opportunity to completely review the statistics legislation. But you are going to need to work with key government agencies to change the law if you're going to change the law. Now, I could have put my next comment here in bold in 100-point font, but changing laws takes time. And there are many statistics officers around the world who have started the process of wanting to change legislation and found that it is something that is not important to anybody else, and it just takes a lot of time. So my key point here is never underestimate the amount of time it will take to change the legislation. The Gulf has its own set of legal frameworks, and in your own countries, and I'm not going to tell you those, you understand that much better than me. You've got a series of legal processes regarding legislation. But I know that from my own experience from my own country, back in New Zealand, it can take 2 or 3 years to get legislation through on something like statistics, because it's not always that important to the other decision makers. So you've got to work with people to help through that process. Perhaps your law is fine, but you know from previous discussions, perhaps from your Director General or other senior people, that the Stats Office doesn't enjoy good government support. So you might need to come up with a plan of how you are going to work more directly, how the office is going to work with senior officials, with ministers. Because to do a register-based census does require support from other parts of government. Perhaps you've got that support, but the relationships with some of your administrative agencies are not as good as they could be. And we're going to talk this afternoon about relationships with administrative agencies. But you need to think about, do we need to develop some relationships with other agencies? For example, in my country, we had once a very bad relationship with our agency that provided data on social benefits. They did not trust us. They wanted to provide that information directly. And it took 2 or 3 years of hard work at different levels, from the DG, the director levels, the statisticians, to work with that agency before they were prepared to provide administrative data. So these things take time. They don't get cured just straight overnight. You might find in some countries that you need public support. Certainly public awareness. Now why, you might think, is that really important? Well, in many countries, the census is not just something that's owned by the Statistics Office. It's also owned by the public. The public like having a census. They think it's an important way of them identifying. And I know from my own country's experience, we certainly have had challenges to engage with the public because they want to tell us how to do it, what topics to include, and how the data should be collected. So I know in my country it will take the people some time to convince the public that it's a good idea to move to completely register-based census. Okay. I touched on the importance of having a clear set of user requirements, so I'm not going to mention that anymore. I want to just come to the point about statistical use of registers. As you're in this early stage of looking at the preconditions, it's important that you've got a good understanding of your current registers, understanding at a broad level the strengths and the gaps. So if your population register, perhaps coming from identity cards, has got gaps, it's important for you to know that. It could still be a really critical data source for you, but you need to know what the gaps are. Where are the areas of weakness? As Mr. Lars said, we as statisticians, we're measuring one thing, the administrative register is measuring something slightly different. You've got to know what is going to be the broad gaps. Maybe it's going to be an opportunity to build your registers from different sources. As part of that, looking at the strengths and the gaps, and as statisticians in this game, I think we will often look more at the gaps than the strengths, but we have to keep remembering the strengths. Particularly important to make sure you've got identifiers, that you can actually link those records. Remember the point that Lars was saying before, we have to be able to produce a record for each individual. So you need to work with your agencies to make sure they're consistently using common identifiers. No point if an agency goes, oh, well, I don't like that government identifier. It doesn't really quite work for me. I'm going to have my own one. And it doesn't matter that they don't link, that don't relate, because I'm just managing this part of the government process. Well, you've got to work with them to find a way of bridging that. So this is a challenge, and this is some suggestions, working with them, talking to them about why it's important. And I'm not going to talk more about quality, because we're going to discuss quality very soon. We've talked a little bit, and we are going to discuss methodologies tomorrow, but just important that you've identified at a broad level how you think you're going to do this register-based census. Going from a traditional to a register-based census requires changes. You need to have thought through those. What are the methods you're going to use? Has your organisation developed some experience with methods? Now, this may not be true in your country, but in many countries, stats officers often use the census as the opportunity to experiment, to do something new. I think it's a positive reflection on the quality of census managers across the world, but I think it's good in terms of methodologies of linking administrative data, that the office has a look at something first, starts to develop some experience. These two gentlemen may have a different view, but that's my view as a former census manager. It's good to have done some experimenting somewhere, and then you can bring that into the census process. But you need to have thought about your methodologies, worked out, and then test them, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Thinking about how you're going to link them. How you're going to link your administrative data, and if you know you're going to need to go back to the field to collect data because not everything's in the register system, how are you going to link it? What does this mean for the traditional process? What does it mean in terms of what you're going to collect, the time period, all of those things, thinking that through. Okay, and I mentioned before, so you identify there's a gap about how you might get the data in. You haven't really thought about the process of bringing the data in. So you have to work with your administrative agencies to determine how you're going to get that data. Is there a shared government network? Perhaps this is a good opportunity for you and your colleagues around the rest of government to have a common network, etc., etc., etc. And I'm deliberately being quick because I do want some time for discussion. Okay, so what we have, I just want to leave the conversation here because I now want to go to discussions in your groups. So my good friend Abdulaziz at the back there is going to hand out some things. Now we've got a couple of groups. Now this was based on the registrations that we had on sort of Thursday morning. So the names might not quite line up completely, and if they don't, that's fine. The key thing is I just want you to split yourselves into two groups, and I've suggested some names for group 1 and some names for group 2. And if your name's not on this list, just have a look and see where the numbers look a bit light and go and sit at that table. So we'll probably have the group 1 table where Mrs. Ayesha is at the moment. Mrs. Ayesha might like to raise her hand so everyone knows who she is if they don't know her already. And the group 2 table can perhaps be up here, this table here that's got where Dwara is. So in a moment when I've explained the little exercise, so these handing out so you can see, and then we want you to look at these 3 things. Which of the preconditions do you think are present in your countries? What are the things that you've got in place at the moment?